Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 907 for November 11th, 2021, as we celebrate 16 years as whiskey's longest-running podcast series. Coming up in a few minutes.
We actually took a race car on the trailer because we had been at Kentucky Motor Speedway doing some testing. Visited there on the way back to go see his family. And as we walked out, I looked at Tom and I said, I don't know about you, but I think we need to open a distillery someday. And he said, let's get married.
That's a very short version of it. That's kind of how it happened, yeah.
Tom Bard and Kim Carter Bard own the Bard Distillery, not in Bardstown, Kentucky, but in the Muhlenberg County town of Graham in western Kentucky. And that race car Kim was talking about, it's hers. She's a former NASCAR driver, now known for driving Miss Mayhem, her monster truck. And Tom turns the wrenches on it while they both make whiskey. I caught up with them this past weekend at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon, and our conversation is coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, your voice, and...
It has been a long catalogue of things that have taxed us this week.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
What do Japan and Scotland have in common? You guessed it, whiskey. That's why Dewars brought these two cultures together in our newest cast series innovation, introducing Dewars 8-year Japanese Smooth. We took the Dewars you know and love and finished it in rare Mizunara oak casks for a complex and balanced Scotch whiskey like no other.
Let's get started with the news, and we'll begin with a major deal announced just this morning, as Ireland's Walsh Whisky Company has been acquired by the Luxembourg-based Amber Beverage Group. Terms of the deal were not disclosed. The move will allow Walsh's Writer's Tears and the Irishman whiskey brands to scale up their growth, while giving Amber Beverage its first exposure to the whiskey market. The company owns more than 100 spirits brands and is a major importer and distributor for other spirits brands in the Baltics. Walsh Whisky co-founder Bernard Walsh will stay on as managing director, along with his entire team, and we should note that Writer's Tears is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, known as COP26, continues this week in Glasgow, Scotland, and it's having an impact around the city. As with any major global conference, streets are being blocked off for security, and whiskey makers are struggling to keep production running on schedule. Most of the major whiskey makers have blending and bottling operations in the Glasgow area, and Chivas Brothers blending director Sandy Hislop told us what his colleagues have been dealing with on our Happy Hour live webcast the other night.
We have had to redirect lorries with tankers coming down from the north. We've had to redirect American barrels coming in from the port. Strathclyde Distillery has struggled to get its spirit out. Yes, it has been a long catalogue of things that have taxed us this week, Mark.
The COP26 conference runs through tomorrow. In other environmental news, Virginia's Filibuster Distillery and owner Sid Dilawri have been ordered to pay a $700,000 fine for violating state environmental laws. Last week's court hearing in Shenandoah County, Virginia, saw the distillery, the Associated Filibuster Barrel Company, and Sid Dilawri plead guilty to 40 separate counts of illegally dumping distillery wastewater into a nearby creek. In exchange, the state dropped the rest of the 115 counts charged in a grand jury indictment last January. The sentence also requires Filibuster to comply with state laws going forward and invest in new environmental equipment. Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring says most of the $700,000 in fines will be returned to Shenandoah County for environmental education and infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, the case of the U.S. State Department's missing bottle of Japanese whiskey continues to baffle investigators. We first reported on this back in August, when a State Department report on diplomatic gifts given to U.S. officials in 2019 noted that a bottle of whiskey given by the Japanese government to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was missing from the department's gift vault. According to Japan Today, the department's Inspector General still has not been able to account for that missing bottle of whiskey, but we now know what that bottle was. It was a 30-year-old Hibiki blended whiskey from Suntory. Pompeo was out of the country when the bottle was delivered to the State Department shortly before the G7 summit in 2019, and he has said he knows nothing about it. The report also notes that most of the 77 people who had access to that gift vault no longer work for the State Department and can't be forced to answer questions. The report also recommended beefing up security around the gift vault. We have a few people on the move this week. Stuart Bowman has been named as distillery manager for Isle of Arran's distillery in Lacranza, Scotland. He most recently supervised the revival of Diageo's Brora distillery before announcing his departure late last month. He replaces former Arran manager David Livingstone, and his successor at Brora is Jackie Robinson. She has worked at a number of Diageo distilleries over the last 17 years. Meanwhile, longtime Bushmills master blender Helen Mulholland has stepped aside after nearly 30 years at the distillery. Her successor is Alex Thomas, who has been at Bushmills since 2004. She helped create the Sexton single malt and was named master blender for the Sexton 4 years ago. No word yet on Helen Mulholland's future plans. We'll have more details on new whiskeys next time around. Until then, you can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. The Spirit of Toronto Festival's Warehouse series of virtual tastings continues this weekend with Michter's Distillery on Friday night, Aberfeldy and Craigellachie Distilleries on Saturday, and Glen Scotia on Sunday. Acker Wines in New York City will have an auction of rare whiskeys and other spirits Friday at the Beekman in Manhattan. One of San Francisco's oldest whiskey bars, Elixir, has a day-long party this Saturday to celebrate its 18th anniversary. Sagamore Spirit Distillery in Baltimore has its annual Penny's Proof release party Saturday, and Julio's Liquors in Westborough, Massachusetts has its annual Whiskey Roadshow that evening. Whiskey Washback DC is on November 19th in Washington, D.C., along with the next Bonham's Whiskey Auction in Hong Kong and the start of the International Whiskey Festival at The Hague in the Netherlands. The Texas Whiskey and Cigar Festival is on November 20th in Fredericksburg, Texas. Interwhiskey 2021 is the weekend of the 26th through the 28th in Frankfurt, Germany, and both the Drambusters Whiskey Festival in Dumfries, Scotland, and the York Whiskey Festival in York, England, return this year on November 27th. Remember, all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, and you may have to show proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test in order to attend. The calendar of events is brought to you by our friends at Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states and 3 continents, and online too. Visit the new BuyVirginiaRye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
It's been 175 years and Dewars continues to stay curious. We're proud to announce the newest addition to the innovative Dewars 8-year cask finish series of Scotch whiskey, Dewars Japanese Smooth. Brought to life by our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod, Japanese Smooth is a perfectly balanced 8-year-old Scotch whiskey that puts a pioneering and innovative focus on our aging process. After 8 years in Scotland, we blend, age again, then finish this whiskey in cask made from 200-year-old Mizunara oak trees. Rare, sure, but worth it. The Mizunara oak perfectly complements the tasty notes with Dewars Scotch whiskey. Japanese Smooth is loaded with Dewars' signature honey and floral notes, with the Japanese Mizunara oak adding exotic sweet and spicy flavors. Curious? Try this one in a perfect Japanese highball or on the rocks.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. Bardstown, Kentucky claims the title of Bourbon Capital of the World, #registered trademark. And with a title like that, one might think the town was named after an old distilling family, but that would be wrong. In fact, it took several generations and almost 2 centuries before the Bard family actually got around to making whiskey, along with a move west to Muhlenberg County and the town of Graham, Kentucky. That's where Tom Bard and his wife Kim Carter Bard opened their Bard Distillery several years ago, near the farm Tom's family has owned since 1823. It's where they make their cinder and smoke bourbon and mule whiskeys, and have a garage big enough for a monster truck. Literally. The Bards were part of a Heritage Grains distilling project this past weekend at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon. We'll have more on that next time around. And I talked with them while they tended one of the stills.
With the Bard Distillery, if the name sounds familiar, the Bard part at least, it's because my 4th great-grandfather, William Bard, was the founder of Bardstown. So if you go to the roundabout there in Bardstown, find the plaque, he's the first name mentioned. And we've always joked about it in the family that our name is on nearly every bottle of bourbon ever made, and we've never made a drop of it. So, that was just kind of a funny thing to talk about at Thanksgiving. But in 2006, Kim and I visited Maker's Mark, first distillery we'd ever been to, fell in love with everything about it, started to learn more, started to network a little bit. And then, after a few more careers and a lot of things going on in life, we decided to finally take the plunge and do this ourselves.
One of those careers is rather unusual. And Kim is cracking up laughing because you know where I'm going with this. How do you go from driving a monster truck to being a distiller?
Well, that's a great question. I really don't have the answer other than, as Tom said, we've both been very blessed in our lives to be in the racing industry. We've enjoyed all the travel and networking that is involved in that. So it's almost a natural progression as far as the marketing goes, not the distillation part. We're familiar with marketing. We know how to sell a brand, basically. So that part is pretty easy to us. But the big wheels and things like that, if I could have everything in the distillery on wheels, which is what I love. Tom's always telling me, we don't need everything on wheels. I just like to be able to roll things around when I need to.
As far as the progression goes, with she and I meeting in NASCAR, and I was on race teams, building race cars and working on them and everything else. And then with her, just our always constant search for excitement in life. This is one of those things that you almost think it's kind of slowed down, but it's not. It's as hectic as racing ever was. But it's kind of a natural progression for us.
Well, and I can answer one more thing. So Tom was actually my crew chief when I drove in the NASCAR Busch Series. So that's how we met. And as he said, we visited Maker's Mark not long after that and both fell in love with the industry. And after we visited, we actually took a race car on a trailer because we had been at Kentucky Motor Speedway doing some testing. Visited there on the way back to go see his family. And as we walked out, I looked at Tom and I said, I don't know about you, but I think we need to open a distillery someday. And he said, let's get married.
That's a very short version of it, but that's kind of how it happened, yeah.
Yeah, usually it's the other way around where the husband says, let's open a distillery, and the wife says, you want to do what?
Right, normally, yeah. But, that's the thing. She and I are a pretty good team because, I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm one of those that I want to overthink and calculate everything, which is great at some extent, but she's one that wants to shoot from the hip and just go ahead and jump out of the airplane, whether she has a parachute on or not. So between the two of us, she basically rolls us down the hill, and then I spend the whole time trying to figure out how we're going to be alive at the end.
One of the things I noticed being in the IndyCar pits at Pocono about 3 or so years ago, when they fire up the engines and that smell of the ethanol, the E85 fuel, smells a lot like a distillery, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and that's one of the things that drew us in. When we walked in Maker's Mark, of course, we smelled that wonderful odor, and it did remind us both of the fuel and all the wonderful smells you get at a racetrack. Some people don't agree with that, but to us, it's nose candy.
So you can actually distill your own fuel if you wanted to.
We could, absolutely. Matter of fact, one of our products, which is, we call it Muhlenberg Silver Mule, it's 124 proof new make whiskey made from bourbon mash, and we tell people, it's like, well, you know, if you want to drink it straight, great. If you want to use it as a cocktail mixer, fine. If you want to use it to start a small lawnmower, feel free.
Tell me about your whiskeys, Kim.
Our whiskeys, we have a bourbon, which is called Cinder and Smoke. We're getting it ready to re-release that, hopefully this month, pending bottles and labels and things like that being remade. Now, the Muhlenberg line is 4 or 5 strong now? 5 strong, right?
4 now. No, 5.
5, that's right.
I don't know. We don't keep up with it anymore. It's hard.
As he mentioned, the Silver Mule whiskey. We also have an apple pie whiskey, a blackberry whiskey, a orange cream whiskey, which is only seasonal.
With and orange cream liqueur.
Thank you. And the salted caramel.
Yeah. But all based on that Silver Mule. We use that as the base. It's a heavily wheated bourbon. It's also the same thing we've been putting in the barrels now for 2 years. So we use it for everything. When it comes off the still, we just see where it goes.
We do have some specialty products that will be coming out this next summer that we will talk more about maybe at a later date.
So which is more fun, being behind the wheel of a race car or making a good bottle of whiskey?
Well, the adrenaline really can't be matched in a race car. As you know, it's something that just gets in your blood, and you really have to feed that every once in a while. But being able to be our own bosses and owning our own distillery and making the decisions day to day, and then finally having that finished product and seeing it on the shelf. So the first time we saw our bourbon on sale at a place of business, it was actually in Madisonville, Kentucky at
Crowded House
restaurant, and I'll never forget that day. We looked up at the bar, and there it was on the shelf, and that was the first time we'd seen it out for sale.
What went through your mind?
We did it. We've made our goal, and now we just need to keep pushing further and on to the next great thing.
Now, how does engineering race cars teach you how to make whiskey?
Well, one thing you hear about in this industry is about chemical engineers, which, trust me, they're like magicians. So they're fantastic to help you actually get a specific type of product that you're going for, and it's wonderful what they know how to do. With mechanical engineering and the type of stuff that we've done, building race cars and doing that for my entire life, that helps you actually, save on costs. When you're trying to start up a distillery, you're trying to bootstrap it, you're trying to do the best you can. So having some pretty good mechanical knowledge allows me to make some of my own equipment. Makes me also know when a potential supplier is blowing smoke. I can identify it pretty quickly, so it comes in pretty handy.
An interview I did several years ago with Dario Franchitti, right after he was, at the time he was working with the Balvenie on one of their craft projects, and he had just gone through a blending class with David Stewart, their malt master. And we compared the ability of a master blender to be able to sniff out a problem and identify it with a race engineer's ability to listen to an engine or diagnose from traces on telemetry exactly what's wrong. Is that a fair comparison?
It absolutely is. It's very, very similar. Because another thing that comes in, that into play that where they're both identical is that if you adjust one small thing, you're probably messing up 4 others. That's how race cars work, and that's also how distillation works. You don't just go turn a knob or make this slight adjustment. You have to take into account what's that doing with everything else. And once you learn your equipment and you learn your process and you trust your process, then when one small thing gets out of kilter, you know it, you feel it, you hear it, you smell it, you taste it. Same thing with race cars. You can tell really quickly by the pitch of an engine or by the way that a car, slides up a little bit into the corner. I've got to start chasing that. And if you got a good experience, you know what to do.
So what is the name of the Munster truck, and are you calling it the Distillery yet?
We're not calling it the Distillery yet, but perhaps maybe a race car in the future. But my truck name is Miss Mayhem.
How much time do you actually have for racing these days with the Munster truck?
Not much, really. I do go to Australia a couple times a year. I'd love to go more, but we're just, with it being a two-person operation, it takes both of us to be there. But when we do go, Tom tries to come with me if it's good timing. Normally January, February are kind of slow months for a distillery, so he has been able to go with me a couple of times.
You going this winter?
I sure hope to, yes.
We have a lot of listeners in Australia. Where will you be running the truck?
I usually end up in Adelaide for a short time, sometimes Sydney, Perth, Australia, and then points in between Adelaide, Sydney, and Perth.
There's a lot of those points.
Yes, a lot of points, right.
Adelaide and Perth are the two main ones, yeah.
We love Australia. If we could live there full time one of these days, we would jump at the chance. Great people, great food. We just really enjoy it.
And they're making some good whiskeys down there, too.
Yes, they do. We've actually been to a couple of the distilleries. The latest one we've gone to is Ounce. They have Ounce Gin.
Yeah, they're in Adelaide. I don't remember the name of it right now.
But the Ounce Gin is very nice.
Where do you hope to take this in the future? Because this is something you can do long after racing is over.
Well, we have a very large facility. We hope to just continue building. You know, we watched Maker's Mark basically go from a large distillery to just an astronomically large distillery, and that was basically our model when we first got into it. So we may be, we would love to be the next mini Maker's Mark.
And one thing that has always been very prevalent in our plans is in the community that we're in, it's an old coal mining town. Of course, coal is going away, and it's really hurt the economy in our area. So we're trying to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem. We're trying to help bring jobs back to our area, bring a lot of pride back to our area. And we're hoping to do that with our distillery. So we've got a lot of great feedback, a lot of support from our community. I think they're happy to have us there, and they're doing what they can to help us out. So we hope to keep growing our community and basically put Muhlenberg County back on the map.
The Bard Distillery will be joining the Kentucky Bourbon Trails Craft Tour next year, and the Bards took part in the Good Deeds Malt Whiskey Charity Project I mentioned on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. They didn't have any malt whiskey to add to that blend, but Kim and Tom traveled all the way to Montana just to help with bottling and labeling it. You'll find a link to the Bard Distillery's website in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Oban, and every sip of Oban is like a postcard from Scotland. Whether it's the classic Oban 14-year-old, the 18-year-old, Oban Little Bay, or the Distiller's Edition, every drop comes from the coastal town of Oban and a distillery just 206 steps away from the sea. It's one of Scotland's smallest distilleries, with just 7 people who make whiskey the same way their predecessors have since 1794. Find out more at obanwhiskey.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. The hashtag concussion from hell is still keeping me from tasting many of the new whiskeys that have been piling up on my tasting table, but I was able to taste a couple over the last week or so. Let's start with the latest Aberfeldy 18-year-old limited edition single malt. This one is finished in French Côte Rôtie red wine casks for 6 months and bottled at 43% ABV. The nose is fruity with touches of fresh berries, red grapes, dried flowers, and hints of honey and vanilla. The taste starts off dry and oaky at first, followed by a burst of fruity and floral character, led by fresh berries, grapes, and a hint of apricots, with a hint of honey in the background. Adding a few drops of water brings out a nice brandy-like touch as well. The finish is long and fruity with a subtle touch of wood spice, and I'm scoring the Aberfeldy 18-year-old Côte Rôtie finish a 94. I mentioned a few of this year's special releases from Diageo last time around, but there are a couple of others that deserve your attention. Royal Lochnagar single malts don't get as much distribution or respect as the distillery deserves, but this year's 16-year-old release is excellent, It's matured in a combination of refill American and European oak casks and bottled at a cask strength 57.5% ABV. The nose is luscious and fruity with touches of green apples, pears, and orange peel, then turns slightly dry and dusty with more time in the glass. The taste starts off honey sweet, followed by a burst of spices and citrusy tartness, while a hint of oak adds character in the background. The finish is long and fruity, with lingering spices and a hint of oak. I'm scoring the 2021 Royal Lochnagar 16-year-old a 93. Cardew is most often thought of as the fingerprint malt for most of the Johnny Walker blends, but it's an excellent single malt in its own right. This year's special releases include a Cardew 14-year-old that was first matured in refill American oak casks, then finished in red wine casks. It's bottled at 55.5% ABV. The nose has notes of green grapes, green apples, citrus, subtle spices, and a hint of shortbread cookies. The taste has a nice balance of subtle spices, fruity tartness, dried flowers, and a hint of honey. The finish, long and tart with touches of lime and orange, along with a subtle hint of spices, too. I'm scoring the 2021 Cardew 14-year-old a 92. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,200 whiskeys from all over the world. You can find it at whiskycast.com. And the What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They're reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye at their Baltimore Farm and Waterfront Distillery. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. When you buy bottles at your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through them. All you have to do is visit sagamorespirit.com and use the code word WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, and we get to welcome a new sponsor for Your Voice this time around. Our thanks to the folks at Hunter Lang & Company and their Scarabus Isla Single Malt for coming on board with us starting this week. We had several comments on our last episode looking at the potential impacts of climate change on Scotch whiskey production. Most of them along the same lines as this tweet from Joel at Odysseus Unbound on Twitter. I'm listening to this week's episode of WhiskyCast, and I think I have a solution for making Scotch whiskey less water-intensive. Bottle everything at cask strength. And this email from Peter Hosek in the Czech Republic. Hope your concussion's impact is diminishing. We need your tasting notes like the recent ones for this year's special releases. I was astonished to hear that you need 46.7 liters of water to produce a liter of whiskey. There's a clear lesson. Since so much water has been used before the bottle hit the shelf, we shouldn't waste additional water by diluting the whiskey in our glass. Thanks for the great podcast, and keep on. Thanks, Peter. And then there's this note from Tom at the Tracer Bullet on Twitter. Mark, I probably missed it, but have you posted if you're able to make it to Sagamore Spirit for the hashtag Penny's Proof Party on Saturday? I'm looking forward to their 4.5-year-old and their just-announced Bottled in Bond release. Getting to talk with you would be the cherry on top. Sorry, Tom, I am not going to be able to make it Saturday. To be honest, I probably should not have gone to Mount Vernon this past Sunday. since it has taken me a few days to recover thanks to the #concussion from hell. But I hope you have a great time Saturday, and if you're able to join us for the Happy Hour live webcast Friday night, the guys from Sagamore Spirit will be joining us during the show. And if there is something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers from around the world, well, you can always find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that fuses craft and cask with time, sea, and air. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The next time you pour a glass of whiskey, gently swirl it around first in the glass before you take a sip, and take a look as the liquid settles. You can learn a bit about a whiskey by watching whether the liquid just glides down the inside of the glass or forms specific streams, what we call the legs of a whiskey. And the more discernible the legs are, the better, as Dewars master blender Stephanie McLeod said the other day during an Aberfeldy Zoom tasting.
Now, there's no scientific basis for this comment that I'm about to make. But I always think that when I see the legs running down slowly down the glass, I always think that's a really good indication that this is going to be a smooth whiskey. And it's never really let me down, actually, that theory. Obviously, it shows viscosity, that there's lots of these lovely fatty acid ethyl esters there, which gives that wonderful mouth-filling quality to the whiskey.
There's a misconception that the lack of legs in a whiskey means it's been chill-filtered. But even chill-filtered whiskeys can have legs. It all depends on how aggressive the filtering process is in removing the oils and fatty compounds that give a whiskey its viscosity. As with many things in life, a gentle touch often gives the best results. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple-distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes, going all the way back to November 12th, 2005. That's right, tomorrow is our 16th anniversary. Thanks for being part of the ride with us. You can get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Just like the end of this WhiskyCast episode, Dewars Scotch Whiskey always makes for a smooth finish. Like our newly released Dewars Japanese Smooth, aged for 8 years in Scotland, blended then aged again before being finished for up to 6 months in Mizunara oak casks made from 200-year-old Japanese water oak trees. These unique casks layer distinct dry and spicy flavors to the whiskey, with aromas reminiscent of sandalwood and incense. Keep an eye out for a bottle of Dewars Japanese Smooth at a store near you.
And now, a Thanksgiving message from Robin Redbreast.
What am I thankful for? Being on the smaller end of the bird scale.
Happy Thanksgiving from Redbreast, proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening for the past 16 years, and please stay safe.